Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Well, I'm so happy to be here and honored to be asked to speak and put on the service by Reverend Nika. I am a member of this congregation. Usually you'll find me out there in one of those green chairs or occasionally over here with the musicians. And today I'm behind this lovely piece of woodwork. Some of my fondest memories going back to childhood are gathered around this time of year. The colors of harvest, the fallen leaves, the subtle change in temperature in Southern California, Thanksgiving. The neighbor behind our house had a large maple or sycamore tree. I don't remember which. I used to get them mixed up. And it was right up against our fence in the backyard, and it dropped half of its leaves into our yard. And my job was to rake the leaves. And what I did was I gathered them into a pile at one end of the yard, and I went to the other end of the yard and ran headlong, flying into the leaves, soaking in, breathing in the musky scent of fall. And then I would repeat this procedure, rake the leaves again, run, jump, over and over again. Eventually, I presume the leaves were put in the trash, although I don't remember doing that. Many of my happy associations about autumn I gathered in public school, Madison Elementary in Lakewood, California, where we crafted Thanksgiving mementos out of construction paper and white glue, which I recall had the faint taste of salt. And we heard the story of the Pilgrims and the Indians. It was a happy story, one of peace, friendship, turkey dressing, and lots of apple pie with ice cream, one could imagine. My teachers from kindergarten through the 5th grade were all women, and they were all kind. I can't remember any of their names, which kills me. My 1st grade teacher was young, tallish, with dark hair. She taught us a little Spanish and American folk songs like Erie Canal. She used to have students do errands for her, like going to the office, and she would select the volunteer by raised hands, and I was always too slow to get my hand up, but I determined I would be picked. So the next time she said, "Who wants to?" my hand shot up, and yay, I was picked. But in my eagerness to get my hand up, I didn't hear what I was supposed to do. So I went into the hall and stood by the door crying until another teacher came along and rescued me. I was never the fastest learner, and eventually I figured out that if I finished an assignment first, then I had undoubtedly missed part of it. My teacher sometimes wrote on my report card that I daydreamed too much. My favorite teacher was my 5th grade teacher. She was Japanese American and super nice. She put the idea into my head that I could find books in the library that were not part of our assignments that I could read just for the joy of the story. And that's when I began reading biographies of famous Americans, Davy Crockett, Kit Carson, Daniel Boone, Andrew Jackson, and my still favorite and hero, Abraham Lincoln. I remember one particular day standing at her desk after class with my friend Bill. I noticed that we are just about the same height as she was, some few inches south of 5 feet. This was new. And I remember also feeling at the same level as her in a different way, not as a friend, but as an equal human being whose intelligence and person was worthy of respect. At school, the classroom was always the safest place because the playground could be a jungle. You never know who you'd have to be, who would challenge you to a fight, who the bullies were, or if you'd be shot in the eye with a bobby pin rocketed by a rubber band. Yes, that happened. A child grows up and learns that life is not fair. that hurt, disappointment, and sadness come with the territory of being human. The names and dates of little emotional consequence to us, like those in Billy Collins' funny poem, we forget. Others that touch our core, we remember. There were 2 sixth grade teachers at Madison, and everybody wanted to be in Mr. Jones' classroom, room 25, last door on the right, because his was supposed to be the most fun. I think he was the only male teacher at Madison, and he's definitely my first male teacher. He wore dark slacks, a short-sleeved white dress shirt, and a skinny dark necktie, and horn-rimmed glasses not too different from the retro style that I am sporting today, same as my father wore. Mr. Jones was quirky, always energetic and full of asides. He told us he brushed his teeth 4 times a day, and his tongue, and urged us to do the same. Have you ever tried brushing your tongue? It's weird. Mr. Jones taught us about conservation, the word which people used before environmentalism. And he told us we could make the world a better place if we picked up litter wherever we saw it. And I started doing that and still do sometimes. At outdoor camp, Mr. Jones took us on a night hike. He showed us how to recognize constellations, like the Big Dipper, the Little Dipper, and Orion, and probably others that I can't remember because, you know. He took us on a day hike, and he showed us the untrampled pine needles off the beaten path. He lifted the leaves layer by layer, year by year, through the decaying organic material until about 6 inches deep, there was humus, that semi-organic material from which new seedlings would sprout. This was like a miracle to me, which could only happen, I might add, because no one was raking the forest. One day, Mr. Jones gave us a lesson in political philosophy. He said, "A conservative is someone who looks at the world and says, 'This is pretty good, we should keep it this way.' A liberal is someone who looks at the world and says, 'This is pretty good, we should make it better.'" I was impressed enough with this to bring it home and repeat it to my father, who I assume would be equally impressed with what I had learned. Dad laughed and said, "That man is a liberal." And then he left it at that. I learned a lot from that exchange. Number one, you can tell more about a person from what they are saying than the thing that they are trying to tell you. Mr. Jones didn't say he was a liberal, but that's what Dad got from his words. Dad didn't say he was a conservative, but that's what I got from his words. Secondly, Dad wasn't worried. He didn't feel like he needed to set me straight on the virtues of conservatism, which, by the way, was a different sort of animal than what passes for that name these days. Dad trusted I was smart enough to find my own way, something that carried through for the rest of his life. A child learns that life is not fair, that there is brokenness in the natural world and brokenness in human relations. Here's a Leonard Cohen lyric for you. You may have heard it before. Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. A wide crack opened for me somewhere near the end of my 6th grade year. My little desk was in the middle of the classroom. One day, Mr. Jones, seated at his big desk in front of the class, gave an assignment. I did not hear it. Perhaps my mind was outdoors thinking about the cool water of the Merced River in Yosemite, where my family would be in a few weeks. Maybe I was in the 1830s Rocky Mountains, trapping fur with Kit Carson. I don't know, but I missed the assignment and was too embarrassed to say anything. So I got out the book I was reading. Ever since 5th grade, I always had a book going, one of my American biographies. Put your book down and do the assignment, Mr. Jones said in front of the whole class. But I still didn't know what the assignment was, and now my skin is turning red and hot, even more embarrassed. So I keep reading my book, not knowing what else to do. Now, if I could stop the film at this point and walk into my child's body with my present wits, I might say to Mr. Jones, "Excuse me, Mr. Jones, but I didn't hear the assignment. I may have a mild version of something you have never heard of called attention deficit disorder. I don't know, but sometimes my mind and imagination wander, and I'm not fully present when I ought to be. You may say that I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. There are actually millions of us. So could you please repeat the assignment?" Or couldn't Mr. Jones have seen a shy, confused boy, never one to cause trouble to that point, and ask if I knew what to do? Well, of course, neither of those things happened. Soon my thoughts are deep into my book, and I do not notice Mr. Jones coming up beside the left side of my desk. He has taken the large dictionary that rested on his desk, and in his anger, slams it down on my desk. My ears are ringing. I am in shock, but I hear him as from a distance say, "Can you hear me now?" Then he leads me outside class and into the hall outside room 25. And with no one in view, puts me against the wall and shakes me hard, and says, "Don't you ever do that to me again." Then he leads me back into the class. It seems he knew what he was doing, taking me out where no one could see, doing his act of violence in such a way that would leave no mark. His words told me he thought of himself as the victim. "Don't you ever do that to me again." I don't remember the rest of the day. My final memory was of a burning, silent rage pulsing through my body. Silent because I never told anybody, not for decades. Mom and Dad died never hearing this story. It probably would have been good if I could have told them, because secrets like this can be an emotional killer. The reasons for silence for any of us with memories such as these that we wish we didn't have are numerous: shame, embarrassment, helplessness. The teacher must be right. He's the teacher. When authority figures commit abuse, coaches, priests and ministers, youth leaders, doctors, it takes a lot to bring it to light. In my generation, boys especially were raised to never show or admit weakness, physical or emotional. Silence was inevitable. Then there is the voice that says, "Maybe it was your fault." And eventually, another voice that says, "What's the big deal? Get over it. Other people have had far worse happen." Which, of course, I know to be true. Now, there are good reasons why some memories are buried deep in the subconscious. It may be necessary for a time for one's survival. Just as there are reasons they begin to surface and need to see the light of day. In the book Shaking, Hitting, Spanking, Dr. Stephen Baveluk writes, "Children who are victims of repeated corporal punishment develop inward feelings of anger, insecurity, and distrust that sooner or later will be directed outward towards society." Upon entering junior high school, I found now most of my teachers were male, just the opposite of elementary school. Subliminally and even a little consciously, I was now mistrustful, and I began to develop my career of class comedian, subtly disrupting class, testing the limits of just how far I could go. My problems with authority figures took me through my junior year in high school, where I spent the last entire quarter of the year in after-school detention. And only this week did it occur to me that I stopped reading my American biographies after the 6th grade. And I wonder if there isn't a connection. I was always one of the smallest kids in my class until I had a growth spurt around the 10th grade. In high school, I grew taller and stronger. On the football field, I learned to receive and give physical punishment. Later, as an adult, I fantasized about paying Mr. Jones a visit to demonstrate in the most tactile way possible all I had become and learned since elementary school. I always knew intellectually this was not the answer, but the sound of his name and his image in my head would arouse anger anew. And I know in a congregation of this size, many of you have your Mr. Jones or hurtful memories that you'd rather not have. So, what to do with a bad memory? 1, don't keep it to yourself. Don't minimize it or deny its significance. Carl Jung wrote that what we don't face consciously comes back as fate, and fate is driven by memory. How we react psychologically to these fields will determine whether our life will be a blessing or we will go in ruin. Far into my adulthood, I began to tell others about Mr. Jones, and stories would come back at me, like the Catholic priest who would rap his clenched knuckle on the heads of his freshman students who failed to do their homework, or who took one of them into the hall and pushed him so hard into the lockers that he bent them, and then hit him so hard with his fists that one of the boy's shoes came off before he ran down the hall to escape. Telling my story connected me to the suffering of others, and at the same time, it reduced the power it had to anger me. The compassion of others touched me. 2, don't run from the hurt. Buddhist writer Pema Chodron teaches, if it's painful, you can learn to hold your seat and move closer to that pain. Reverse the usual pattern, which is to split, to escape. Instead, you let it awaken your heart and soften you. In Start Where You Are, Chodron teaches a form of meditation called Tonglen. It has 4 stages. First, you open up, simply settle yourself. Then you breathe, visualizing breathing in dark, heavy, and hot. Then you breathe out white, light, and cool, and you repeat that. Then in stage 3, you work with the pain of a specific individual. The specific pain, you could start with an animal that's hurt, a pet, something that's easy, your own child, and you work on that, and you feel the compassion. You feel the pain, and you feel the compassion. Finally, you extend this wish to relieve suffering much further to people you do not know, and to all who similarly suffer as this individual person. With the 3rd step, as I said, you can start with something easy, a child you love. Then you gradually move to people you actually hate, people you consider to be your enemies or to have actually harmed you. Well, this is the hard part, of course, but it's the part we need the most to free ourselves from the pain of anger and to live joyously. 3, show compassion to yourself. Years ago, my wife, Debbie, sat over there on the drum, sang with us, got some valuable help from a therapist, and with her permission, I share it with you today. The therapist said, you carry within yourself two people. There is the child, the little girl who is hurt. And there is the adult woman full of empathy who would do anything to protect her own children. Why don't you let that caring person comfort the child who was hurt? So I speak to the child I was. The child inside me, I understand. You didn't deserve that. It wasn't your fault. I'm sorry it happened to you. 4, don't grieve alone. Friday night, Debbie and I were at a private event in Thousand Oaks, which our friends called Healing in Harmony. Just as many of us have been doing here, people from our area of Thousand Oaks came to share the grief and gratitude over what we have been going through here with the tragic shooting and the fires. Memories are being formed now, and we need to frame them in a context of sharing and compassion and grieve together, openly, together, not alone. In Judaism, there is a mourning tradition of sitting Shiva, where the death of a loved one, after the death of a loved one, the family opens their home for 7 days to receive relatives who share their condolences. Rabbi Kushner, in his book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, shares that often the family who meet with him after a death and before a funeral service will ask him, do we really need to sit Shiva? To have all those people crowding into our living room? Couldn't we just ask them to leave us alone? My response, says Kushner, is no. Letting people into your home, into your grief, is exactly what you need now. You need to share with them, to talk to them, to let them comfort you. You need to be reminded that you are still alive and part of a world of life. If something has happened to us, to me, to you, long ago, that we never acknowledged or grieved over, it is not too late now. Maybe in a chalice circle this month where we focus on memory. Kevin is in his 60s. His mother died of ovarian cancer when she was 31, and he was just 8 years old, and nobody talked about it. His memories are full of pain. There was no grieving together. He puts it like this: when someone well-known like John Kennedy dies tragically, everyone talks about it and grieves together. With us, it was just our little circle, and nobody talked about it, ever. His father's response was to become remote and unavailable, adding tragedy upon tragedy. Kevin's response was to grow up thinking he was an unworthy person. So he did good deeds to prove he was worthy, but it was never enough. It can never be enough. Only now, over the last year, by talking about it and grieving openly, is he able to see how wrong that is. He is already a good person, not for what he does or does not accomplish. And he enjoys helping others because it feels good. He has planned a visit to his mother's grave, the first, with his sister to finish the grieving, long deferred. Can we be grateful for our memories, even the bad ones? Here's an even better question. Since these things have happened, how should I respond? As Kushner says, we, by our responses, give suffering either a positive or a negative meaning. by choosing to live, by choosing love, we give meaning to life in all its dark and light corners. I should not run from these memories. I should invite them into the totality of my world. I should breathe in the dark and heavy and breathe out brightness and light. Opening the heart of compassion that is accessible to all of us. Knowing in the words of the old hymn in our gray hymnal, this old world is full of sorrow, full of sickness, weak and sore. If you love your neighbor truly, love will come to you the more. Last weekend, I was in the Santa Cruz Mountains with my wife and daughter, people who know and love me, and I them. And I did what I often do when near a woods. I found a remote patch off the path, and I parted the fallen redwood leaves with my fingers, layer by layer, year by year, until about 6 inches deep, I found the humus. And in it, like Wilfred, I found something warm, something from long ago, something that makes you cry, something that makes you laugh, something as precious as gold. And I looked about and I saw the small cones emptied of their seeds and redwood saplings nearby. And I marveled at the cycle of old and new, life and death, and life again, of which I am a part. And I felt whole and grateful. May it be so.